The champagne was still cold. On June 17, 1989, in the marina town of Pelican Cove, Florida, population 2,400. The last day of summer arrived early that year. Thick salt air, white pelicans on the dock pilings. The kind of morning that makes newlyweds feel like the world was built specifically for them. At 8:46 in the morning, Frank DeLuca, the dock attendant at Bayshore Marina, watched a young couple carry a rented cooler down the wooden pier toward Slip 14. The man had a camera bag over one shoulder. The woman was laughing at something he'd said. She was still wearing her wedding ring, the one she'd gotten 4 days earlier. Frank DeLuca would later tell investigators that he waved and they waved back. And then they stepped onto the rental boat and the engine turned over. And they headed out past the channel markers into the open Gulf. What happened in the next 6 hours would consume Pelican Cove for the next 2.5 decades. The rental boat came back. It came back empty, engine running, drifting into the eastern edge of the marina at 3:14 in the afternoon. No couple aboard. No camera bag. No cooler, just the boat. The key still in the ignition, and 2 untouched glasses of champagne sitting in the cup holders on the stern, still cold from the ice that had melted around them. The couple had been gone 6 hours. Nobody had seen them leave the boat. Nobody had heard anything. That is not a story about 2 people who fell overboard on a careless afternoon. That is a story about a man who had done this before, or something close enough to it, and who had spent 26 years sleeping in the same house, eating at the same diner, and accepting credit cards at the same marina counter, while the families of 2 people waited for an answer they deserved. To understand what was found 60 feet below the surface of the Gulf of Mexico in the autumn of 2015, you first have to understand who Michael and Karen Ashworth were before the morning of June 17, 1989. Because they were not just newlyweds. They were the kind of people a town remembers. Knoxville, Tennessee, in the late spring of 1989, was still a place where you got married in your hometown church, had the reception in the church hall, and invited everyone who had known you your whole life, which in Michael and Karen's case was most of Meridian Street, and 2 full pews of Karen's nursing school classmates. Michael Ashworth was 27 years old. He was a high school history teacher at Knoxville Central, the kind of teacher who kept a globe on his desk and used it to trace the routes of every historical event he taught, which drove the administration slightly crazy and made his students the most engaged kids in the building. He had proposed to Karen in March using a ring his grandmother had worn for 40 years, resized at a jewelry shop on Gay Street. Karen Ashworth, née Holloway, was 26 years old and 18 months into her nursing career at University of Tennessee Medical Center, where she worked pediatric recovery and was known among her colleagues for 2 things: the handmade cards she left in her patients' rooms when she ended a shift, and the way she could get a frightened child calm in under 3 minutes by singing one specific verse of an old Tennessee hymn that nobody else in the ward knew. She had a younger brother named David, who had been the ring bearer at the wedding and spent the entire reception trying to talk Michael into a fishing trip. She had a mother named Rose who cried during the first dance and then apologized for crying and cried again. The wedding was June 13, 1989. 4 days later, Michael and Karen loaded a rental car in Knoxville and drove 8 hours south to Pelican Cove, Florida, a small Gulf Coast town they had chosen from a travel brochure at the AAA office on Kingston Pike. Blue water, white sand, a marina with rental boats. They had booked a room at the Pelican Cove Inn, a 2-story white clapboard inn 1 block from the water. They checked in on the evening of June 16th. The innkeeper, a woman named Betsy Ware, later told investigators she remembered them clearly because the man had carried both suitcases and the woman had stopped in the lobby to compliment the flowers on the front desk, which were marigolds from Betsy's own garden. On the morning of June 17th, they had breakfast at the inn. eggs, toast, the orange juice that came in a small glass, and they walked to Bayshore Marina to pick up the rental boat they had reserved. They stopped at a bait and ice shop on the way and bought a cooler, 2 bottles of Coke, and a bottle of champagne. They were going to anchor somewhere quiet, Karen had told the girl at the register. It was their honeymoon. The girl at the register had smiled and said that sounded perfect. She never knew she was the last person outside the marina to see them alive. At 3:14 that afternoon, a teenager named Corey Baines, who had been fishing off the eastern dock, noticed the rental boat drifting in without anyone aboard. He called out. No answer. He flagged down Frank DeLuca, the dock attendant. Frank tied off the boat and stepped aboard. The key was in the ignition. The engine was running. The champagne glasses were in the cup holders, still holding a few inches of liquid. Frank cut the engine. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to the marina office and called the Pelican Cove harbor master at 3:22. By 4 o'clock, the Pelican Cove Police Department and the Collier County Sheriff's Marine Unit were in the water. 2 patrol boats ran the nearshore search grid. A Coast Guard vessel was notified and expanded the search 12 miles offshore. Divers checked the nearshore bottom around the marina's eastern channel. The search ran until dark and resumed at sunrise the following morning. No bodies, no debris field, nothing overboard. What investigators documented in the first 48 hours was sparse. The boat showed no signs of collision damage. The fuel tank was roughly 2/3 empty, consistent with a 4 to 5 hour run. The champagne glasses bore fingerprints later confirmed as belonging to Michael and Karen. There was a smear of something dark on the starboard gunwale. It was tested, logged as motor grease or bilge residue, and set aside. One detail entered the file quietly and was not revisited for years. The boat's rental log showed it had been pre-cleaned and fueled that morning by the marina's owner, a man named Dennis Carver, who had been running Bayshore Marina for 11 years. Dennis had initialed the log at 7:50 a.m. He told investigators he had seen the couple arrive, helped them aboard, given them the standard safety briefing, and watched them leave. He said he couldn't recall anything unusual about them or their departure. His statement was recorded at 4 pages and filed without follow-up. The Collier County Sheriff's Office opened a formal missing persons investigation on June 19th, 2 days after the boat returned. By June 25th, the working theory was accidental drowning, a wave, a moment of imbalance. Both in the water before either could reach the other. The Gulf waters in that area ran swift and warm, and the currents could carry a body south toward the Keys before any surface search reached it. The theory was not wrong on its face. It was simply incomplete. And the part it was missing would not surface for 26 years. The lead investigator assigned to the case was a Collier County Sheriff's detective named Marlene Voss, 43 years old, 12 years on the force, and the kind of officer who understood that tourist disappearances in coastal communities had a political dimension that land cases didn't. Bad publicity for the charter industry, pressure from the Chamber of Commerce, and a tendency for cases to be administratively resolved into the accidental category before all the threads had been pulled. She had seen it happen twice before, and she did not intend to let it happen here. Marlene Voss spent the first week on the water herself, talking to every marina hand, every charter captain, every liveaboard in the Pelican Cove anchorage. She developed 2 persons of interest in the first 10 days. The first was a transient boater named Ray Coffin, who had been anchored in the cove during the period in question and had left the area quickly on the night of June 17th. Marlene tracked Ray Coffin to a marina in Sarasota and interviewed him for 3 hours. He had an alibi. A documented fuel stop in Fort Myers on the afternoon of June 17th logged in the harbormaster's records there. It was eliminated. The second person of interest came from an anonymous tip on day 12, a note left at the police department's front desk, handwritten, that said Dennis Carver had had a previous problem at the marina involving a boat and an insurance claim. Marlene Voss pulled the insurance records. In 1986, a rental boat had gone missing from Bayshore Marina under circumstances that resulted in a $30,000 payout from the marina's liability insurer. The boat was never recovered. The renter's family had been told it was an accident. The case had been handled by a different agency, a different era, different investigators who were no longer on the force. Marlene requested the full 1986 file. It took 9 weeks. When it arrived, it was thinner than she expected. 41 pages, no photographs, 1 witness statement. She read it twice. Then she drove to the marina and stood at the counter and looked at Dennis Carver and thought about how long a man could stand in one place while the world moved around him. She had nothing she could take to a prosecutor. She knew what she suspected. She could not prove it. The Collier County Sheriff's Office reclassified the Ashworth case as a cold case in October 1991. 2 years and 4 months after Michael and Karen disappeared. Karen's mother, Rose Holloway, called Marlene Voss's direct line the day the notice arrived in the mail. The conversation lasted 9 minutes, and Marlene Voss never forgot a single second of it. By 1997, 8 years had passed since the honeymoon morning in Pelican Cove. Michael's mother had sold the house on Meridian Street and moved to her sister's place in Nashville. She could not live in a house where Michael's old bedroom still had his globe on the shelf and his lesson plans in the drawer. Karen's brother David, who had been 11 years old and wanting to go fishing with his new brother-in-law, was grown now, working a job in Atlanta, married himself with a daughter he had named Karen, middle name Rose. He drove to Pelican Cove once a year, every June, and walked the dock at Bayshore Marina and stood at the slip where the empty boat had come back. He never spoke to anyone when he went. He just stood there. By 2004, 15 years on, Marlene Voss had retired from the Collier County Sheriff's Office. She was 60 years old, and her knees were bad, and she had grandchildren in Bonita Springs and a garden that needed her. She kept 1 box. It lived under her workbench in the garage, behind the bag of potting soil. Her husband knew about the box and never suggested she get rid of it. After 30 years of marriage, he had a fair sense of which things you could suggest and which you couldn't. Dennis Carver was still running Bayshore Marina. He had expanded it in 1999, added a dry storage facility and a small fuel dock. He had served on the Pelican Cove Chamber of Commerce for 4 years. He had remarried in 2003. He had, by every outward measure, lived a full and forward-moving life. The girl at the bait shop had long since left town. The dock attendant Frank DeLuca had passed away in 2008. Corey Baines, the teenager who had first noticed the drifting boat, was 41 years old and living in Ocala. The reward poster that Karen's family had printed in 1990, $5,000, a phone number. A photograph of Michael and Karen on the church steps still in their wedding clothes had long since disappeared from the bulletin boards of Pelican Cove. 1 copy, laminated, still hung on the wall inside Betsy Ware's Inn, next to the front desk. Betsy had kept it there for 26 years. She watered her marigolds every morning and walked past it every day, and nobody who stayed at her inn ever asked about it. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now let's get back to Michael and Karen. The case had been cold for 24 years when a recreational diver named Phil Garrett went looking for a World War II wreck site and found something no chart had ever marked. Phil Garrett was 53 years old and had been diving the Gulf Coast for 25 years. He was not a professional. He ran a tile business in Naples and dived on weekends, mostly for the silence of it, the particular quiet of 60 feet of water overhead, the way sound becomes irrelevant, and you exist entirely inside the present moment. On a Saturday in September 2015, he was following GPS coordinates for a reported debris field from a 1944 Liberty ship when his light caught something on the sandy bottom that was not a ship and not natural reef. It was a vehicle, four-door sedan, heavily silted, encrusted with 26 years of sea growth, resting upright on the Gulf floor in 62 feet of water approximately 4 miles offshore from Pelican Cove. Phil circled it twice. He shone his light through the driver's side window. He could see the interior, the seats, the dashboard, the floor, and lying on the rear seat, visible through the glass, was something bright enough to catch light even through the silt and the years. It was a camera bag, navy blue nylon with a yellow zipper pull. Phil Garrett surfaced, marked the coordinates on his GPS unit, and called the Collier County Sheriff's Office from his boat. "I think I found something you need to see," he said. He had no idea what he had found. He had no idea that 26 years earlier, a young man had carried that bag down a wooden pier on a June morning, while a young woman laughed at something he'd said. Investigators were on site the following morning. The vehicle was a 1983 Buick LeSabre registered to Dennis Carver, reported stolen from a shopping center parking lot in Naples in July 1989, 1 month after the Ashworth disappearance. The theft report had been filed by Dennis Carver himself. The car had been driven into the Gulf via a boat launch ramp on a stretch of undeveloped coastline 4 miles north of Pelican Cove. Forensic analysis, conducted by the Collier County Sheriff's Office with assistance from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, confirmed the presence of biological material consistent with 2 individuals. The camera bag was recovered and was confirmed through its serial number, registered in a warranty card that Michael Ashworth had mailed to the manufacturer in April 1989 to belong to Michael Ashworth. The forensic process used to confirm the vehicle's connection to the marina involved cross-referencing marine growth samples with historical water temperature data to establish how long the car had been submerged. The technique, used increasingly in cold case investigations involving submerged vehicles, confirmed the car had entered the water within weeks of the Ashworth's disappearance. Marlene Voss received a call from the current lead investigator on a Tuesday morning in October 2015. She was 69 years old, sitting in her garden with a cup of coffee. She listened without speaking until the investigator finished. Then she said, "It was his car." It was not a question. Dennis Carver was 67 years old in October 2015. He had, by all accounts that his Pelican Cove neighbors offered to reporters in the days following his arrest, been a fixture of that marina and that town for decades. He sponsored the youth fishing tournament every July. He kept a jar of hard candy on his counter for customers' kids. He had given the eulogy at Frank DeLuca's funeral in 2008, standing at the podium of the Pelican Cove Methodist Church, talking about loyalty and community and the way a small town holds its people. In hindsight, the specific, clarifying hindsight that arrives only after the thing everyone missed becomes the thing everyone discusses. There were details that rearranged themselves. The way Dennis had been the one to initially clean and fuel the rental boat that morning, which put him alone on it for over an hour before the Ashworths arrived. The fact that the 1986 insurance claim the one Marlene Voss had pulled in 1989, involved a rental boat that had departed from Slip 14. The same slip the Ashworths had used. The way Dennis had, in his formal statement to investigators in 1989, volunteered that the couple had seemed distracted, a detail no one had asked about, and that appeared nowhere else in any witness account. The 1986 incident, investigators determined, had not been an accident. The pattern, reconstructed from insurance records, marina logs, and testimony from a former marina employee who had worked at Bayshore in the mid-1980s and had since moved to Pensacola, suggested that Dennis Carver had used the isolated geography of the Gulf, the deep water, the currents, the way the sea keeps secrets, as both a mechanism and a graveyard. The Ashworths had not been targeted specifically. They had simply been in the wrong boat on the wrong morning. And Dennis Carver had decided that whatever they had witnessed on that water outweighed his willingness to let them return to the dock. Investigators determined that Dennis had followed the Ashworths in a second boat, a personal vessel he kept at the marina's private slip. They determined this from fuel records and from a marina hand who had seen Dennis leave in his personal boat that morning and return mid-afternoon, and who had not thought to mention it in 1989. Because nobody had asked. Nobody had asked. Dennis Carver was arrested at Bayshore Marina on the morning of October 22, 2015. Pelican Cove police officers and Collier County Sheriff's deputies arrived at 6:50 a.m. He was at the fuel dock when they pulled in. He watched them come toward him across the dock, and he set down the fuel hose he was holding, and he did not run, and he did not speak. He allowed the handcuffs without resistance. As they were walking him up the dock toward the patrol cars, one of the deputies later recalled, Dennis Carver looked back once at the water, just once. Then he looked away and didn't look back again. His former wife filed for divorce within the week. His name was removed from the Chamber of Commerce roster. The youth fishing tournament he had sponsored for 19 years was renamed. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of insurance fraud, and 2 counts of concealing a death. He was convicted on all counts in March 2017 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 69 years old at sentencing. He made no statement. The families of Michael and Karen Ashworth were present in the courtroom. Karen's brother David sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, and when the verdict was read, he put his face in his hands for a moment. And then he looked up, and the expression on his face, according to the reporter covering the trial, was not what you would call relief. It was something older and quieter than relief. It was the look of a man who had waited long enough for the world to tell him he had been right to keep going back to that dock. Michael Ashworth had a globe on his desk and a way of tracing routes across it that made his students understand that history was not something that happened to other people in other times, but something that happened to real people in real places who had not known what was coming. He had been 27 years old and in love and on his honeymoon, and he had carried a camera bag down a pier on a June morning because he wanted to photograph the Gulf with his wife. That was the entirety of his crime against the world. That was everything that had been enough. Karen Ashworth had sung a specific verse of a Tennessee hymn to frightened children in a recovery ward, and they had gone calm, and she had written them handmade cards before she left their rooms, and she had planned to spend the rest of her life doing work that mattered. She had bought champagne for an anchor spot somewhere quiet, because it was her honeymoon and she was 26 years old, and the world was, on that particular morning, exactly as beautiful as she believed it to be. Rose Holloway, Karen's mother, passed away in 2012, 3 years before the car was found. She never had her answer. Her daughter David, who was Karen's brother David now, said in a statement after the conviction that he believed his mother had known all along. The same way you know things when you are a parent, and someone takes your child and offers you a version of events that doesn't fit the shape of the person you raised. He said she had kept faith. He said that was what he intended to tell his daughter, Karen, when she was old enough to understand the story. The Pelican Cove Police Department, in partnership with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, updated its marine disappearance protocols following the Ashworth case. Rental records, fuel logs, and the personal vessels of marina operators are now included in standard evidence collection in any disappearance involving rented watercraft. What does it mean that a man can sponsor a children's fishing tournament every year for nearly 2 decades after taking 2 lives and be considered by his community a decent person? What does it mean for the families who built their lives around the absence of an answer, knowing that somewhere the answer existed, concrete and recoverable, 60 feet below the water? And if Phil Garrett had chosen a different wreck site that September morning, if the coordinates had been 50 yards to the east, how long would the Gulf have kept its secret? These questions do not resolve cleanly, but they are worth the time it takes to sit with them. Justice found Michael and Karen Ashworth after 26 years. Stories like theirs are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing, no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you never miss the next case. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.